If today one climbs this green, wind-swept hill, one can see only the remains of former greatness. Piles of ruined masonry overgrown with grass, a moat and silence, which is broken only by tourists and birds. But if we want to understand the true history of this place, we need to forget what we see now. We need to erase the ivy from the walls, return the stones to their place, and then remove them entirely to see that with which it all began, an empty hill above the bend of the river. The history of any castle begins not with the architect and not with the first stone. It begins with fear. Let us transport ourselves mentally to the middle of the 10th century. Europe at this time is a dangerous, dark, and unpredictable place. The great empire of Charlemagne has long since disintegrated into a patchwork quilt of warring territories. Kings formally exist, but their power is weak and ghostly. The king is somewhere far away, but danger is here, right on the doorstep. From the north, Viking longships descend along the rivers, ravaging the coasts and penetrating deep into the continent. From the east, swift Hungarian horsemen swoop in. From the south, the Saracens threaten. But even if external enemies retreat, there remains the neighbor who wants to take your harvest, your land, and your people. In this world, there is no police, no regular army that will come to help at the first call. Safety in the 10th century is a commodity that must be obtained by oneself. It is at this moment that the idea of the castle is born. It is an answer to the crisis of power. Local leaders, large landowners, or simply lucky warriors understand there is nowhere to wait for help from. One must take protection into one's own hands. Our nameless founder chooses the place not for the sake of the beautiful view over the valley, although the view opening from here is indeed stunning. This decision is dictated by cold military logic and the thirst for profit. Look at the landscape through the eyes of a person of that time. Here, the river makes a sharp turn, slowing its run. A little further is a ford, the only place for 30 kilometers where trade wagons can cross to the other bank. Nearby passes an old road remaining from the times of the Romans. He who controls this hill controls the crossing, and he who controls the crossing owns the road. For our hero, this place is the ideal point for business. He will be able to collect a toll from every merchant carrying salt, iron, or fabrics. But to collect money, force is needed, a base is needed. Here, it is important to make one significant clarification. We are used to calling any fortifications fortresses, but historians draw a clear line. A Roman fort was built for a legion. It was a state object. City walls protected a community of citizens. But a castle is a private fortress. It is the home of a lord, his family, and his personal retinue. It is a symbol that power on this land now belongs to a specific person and not to a distant monarch or an abstract law. Imagine our founder. Most likely, this is not a refined aristocrat in silks, as descendants will paint him 500 years later. This is a stern warrior whose scars on his face speak of dozens of petty skirmishes. He wears chainmail that weighs more than 10 kilograms and smells of horse sweat and campfire. He received this place either by force or as a reward for service to a suzerain, but he must hold it himself. In the 10th century, the construction of a castle is a daring challenge. Often such fortifications were erected without the permission of the king. This was called adulterin or illegal castles. A man simply fenced off a territory, placed armed men, and declared himself the master of the district. Peasants from neighboring villages, intimidated by raids, came to him themselves. They exchanged their freedom and part of the harvest for a promise. When the enemy comes, I will shelter you behind my wall. It was a harsh social contract. The castle became a center of gravity. Life began to revolve around it. Here the guilty were judged. Here grain was brought. Here weapons were forged.
But let us return to our hill. As yet, there are neither high towers nor drawbridges here. The resources of our founder are limited. He has no money for hired masons from Italy, no army of engineers. He has only a few dozen dependent peasants, shovels, axes, and a very lot of wood around. The first castle that will appear on this spot will look nothing like the stone giants from movies about knights. It will look rude, primitive, but incredibly effective for its time. This will be the era of earth and wood, an era when, to become a lord, it was enough to dig a deep hole and pile up a high mountain. Our hero gives the order. The peasants, grumbling and cursing the hard work, begin to bite into the stony soil of the hill. Construction begins, which will stretch for a century, survive dozens of sieges, and see a change of dynasties and technologies. But for now, only the sound of axes and the sound of crumbling earth are heard. The history of the castle has begun. If a modern person found themselves on this hill at the end of the 10th century, they would experience strong disappointment. Instead of the majestic stone stronghold that our imagination paints at the word castle, they would see something resembling a fortified farmstead, or at best, a frontier fort from the times of the settlement of the Wild West. No crenellated walls, no lancet windows, only earth, logs, and clay. But one should not be deceived by the humble appearance. Before us is the Motte and Bailey, a genius invention of military engineering of its time. This construction was so effective, cheap, and quick to erect that in a couple of centuries it spread from Normandy to Poland, forever changing the landscape of Europe. Let's break down this structure, because it was exactly this that laid the foundation of our future castle in the literal and figurative sense. The name Motte and Bailey consists of two parts. The motte is the man-made hill. The bailey is the inner courtyard at its foot. Everything is genius and simple. But behind this simplicity stands titanic labor. Our Lord ordered a deep moat to be dug around the summit of the natural hill. In the 10th century, a moat is not so much an obstacle with water. Water on an elevation is generally a rarity, as it is a quarry. All the earth, clay, and stones that the peasants removed from the moat they carried to the center, piling up an artificial mountain, layer by layer, compacting the soil with feet and beetles. As a result, a truncated cone with a height of 5 to 15 meters was obtained. The slopes were made as steep as the physics of the soil allowed, so that climbing them in heavy armor was almost impossible. And on the flat top of this earthen pie, they erected the main tower, still wooden for now. Around the tower went a palisade, sharpened logs dug deep into the ground. This was the last line of defense. If the enemy broke through the outer perimeter, the defenders retreated here, to the summit, to this ark of salvation. But living on the summit was inconvenient, cramped, windy, problems with water delivery. Therefore, daily life flowed below. In the bailey, this is a vast courtyard adjoining the hill. Here were located the stables, smithy, barns, kitchen, and barracks for the garrison. The bailey was also surrounded by its own moat and a wall of logs. Why wood? Why not stone? After all, the Romans built from stone 1,000 years ago. The answer lies in economics and speed. Stone requires a quarry, delivery, processing, lime, and mainly qualified masons of whom there was a catastrophic shortage in Europe in the 10th century. Wood, however, grows everywhere. To fell an oak and heave it, an architect is not needed. Just a strong man with an axe is needed. A wooden castle of the Motte and Bailey type could be erected by the forces of 100 unskilled workers in just 3 to 4 months. In conditions of constant war, speed was more important than durability. History knows cases when Norman conquerors brought with them ready-made, disassembled wooden forts on ships to assemble them on the enemy shore in one day.
But let's look at this fortress through the eyes of an attacker. You approach the hill and see before you a solid wall of logs 3 to 4 meters high. The logs are fitted tightly, the gaps are smeared with clay. Archers look at you from above. Even if you overcome the moat and cut a passage in the palisade of the courtyard, you will find yourself in a trap. You will have to storm the hill itself, the motte. The only way up is a narrow wooden bridge thrown across the internal moat. This bridge is called flying because in case of danger, the defenders can easily collapse it or raise it. The attacker is left only to scramble up the steep, crumbling slope under a hail of arrows and stones flying from above. From a tactical point of view, this is a nightmare. The main tower on the top of the hill in this period is not a luxurious palace. It is a dark, gloomy blockhouse of several stories. Below is a warehouse for supplies in case of a long siege, barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, perhaps a cistern with rainwater. Above is the hall for warriors. At the very top are the lord's chambers. There is no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters that are tightly closed in winter to escape the cold. The hearth is often simply in the middle of the room, and the smoke goes out through a hole in the roof. The walls are black from soot. But the wooden castle had one deadly enemy, not the battering ram and not the catapult, fire. Wood, especially dry wood soaked in resin, burns perfectly. To set fire to such a castle, one does not need to approach closely. A lucky shot with a burning arrow or an incendiary projectile is enough. If the wind blows in the right direction, the fortress can turn into a torch in half an hour. The defenders knew this. Fighting fire was the main headache of the garrison. In dry weather, the walls and roofs of the towers were hung with raw ox hides. Imagine this smell. Dozens of freshly skinned wet hides heating in the sun, mixing with the smell of smoke and sewage. But these hides saved lives. Wet skin burns poorly and does not let the fire jump to the wood. Besides that, barrels with water and sand stood everywhere. Our castle stood in wooden form for almost 100 years. It survived several minor sieges, burned twice, but each time it was rebuilt anew. Burnt logs were replaced with new ones, the moat was deepened, the mound was topped up. However, by the end of the 10th century, the world began to change. The Lord's power strengthened, income from tolls at the crossing and from harvests grew. An economic boom began in Europe. The old, hastily cobbled-together wooden towers ceased to correspond to the status and ambitions of the owners, and mainly, the siege technologies of enemies also did not stand still. Bows became more powerful, incendiary mixtures more cunning, and wood rots. Every 20 years, a wooden fortress needed major repairs. The lower crowns of the log structures touching the ground turned into dust, and the bridge supports rotted. Our lord, or rather already his grandson or great-grandson, got tired of patching holes. He wanted to build a house that would stand for eternity. The moment arrived when not lumberjacks climbed the hill, but people with a different tool, stonemasons. They looked at the wooden tower with professional contempt. The era of wood and earth was coming to an end. The era of stone was beginning, which would give us that very silhouette familiar to everyone. But the price of this transition would be astronomical. The decision to replace wood with stone was perhaps the most difficult financial decision in the life of our Lord. This can be compared to if the owner of a small transport company today suddenly decided to build a private spaceport. The gap in cost between a wooden tower and a stone donjon, keep, was colossal. Dependent peasants built the wooden fort for food and protection. The stone castle required money, live, ringing coins in huge quantities. In the 10th century, the economy of Europe begins to revive, and work boils on our hill, which will last not months, but years, sometimes decades. The construction site of a medieval castle is an anthill working according to strict technologies. First of all, logistics change. Stone is heavy. If the quarry is located further than 10 kilometers from the construction site, the cost of delivery exceeds the cost of the material itself. Therefore, our Lord looks for stone nearby. If lucky, stone is quarried right from the moat, making it even deeper. In the center of the former wooden courtyard, a giant begins to grow, the Great Tower or donjon. This is the heart of the stone castle. The walls of the donjon are erected using the layer cake technology. Masons lay out the outer and inner facing from neatly hewn blocks, and the space between them, sometimes 3 or 4 meters thick, is filled with rubble, broken stone, gravel, and all this is flooded with slaked lime. Lime is brought by carts, slaked in huge pits, and this mortar will set inside the wall for years. Archaeologists dismantling ruins sometimes find raw mortar in the center of the masonry even after 800 years.
Look at this dungeon. It is a square plant tower about 30 meters high. It looks indestructible, but it has a strange feature. At ground level, there are no doors, a smooth, blind wall. The entrance to the tower was always located at the level of the 2nd or even 3rd floor. A narrow wooden staircase built onto the outside led to it.
In case of danger, the defenders simply burned or collapsed this staircase, and the dungeon turned into an impregnable stone safe. To get inside, the enemy needed to climb ladders under fire or try to break through a wall several meters thick. Inside, the dungeon was dark and cold. The windows of the first tier are narrow slits, loopholes, letting in more draft than light. There is still no glass. It is insanely expensive. Oiled cloth or skin is stretched over the windows, or wooden shutters are closed. But it is here, in this stone sack, that the Lord feels like a real ruler. Stone gives a sense of eternity. A wooden house can burn down from an accidental spark from the fireplace. A stone dungeon does not fear fire. However, the first stone towers had one fatal engineering error, which was not realized immediately. They were square or rectangular. Corners. A corner is the weakest place of any square building. Firstly, a corner limits visibility. If the enemy approaches the very joint of two walls, the archers on the roof or in the loopholes simply will not see him. A dead zone is formed, where one can calmly work with a pickaxe, picking stones out of the foundation. Secondly, a corner is constructively fragile. If siege engineers start making a sap tunnel under the corner of the tower, it will collapse much faster than a round wall. Furthermore, siege engines, battering rams, or throwing projectiles easily chip off pieces of masonry when striking a corner. Evolution was ruthless to those who did not learn. By the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th centuries, the shape of towers begins to change. Cylinders replace squares. A round tower is the geometric perfection of defense. It has no corners, which means no blind spots. Visibility is ideal in all directions. But the main thing is the physics of the impact. A stone launched from a catapult upon striking a round surface often passes tangentially, ricochets, not giving the wall all its destructive energy. Our castle is also being rebuilt. The old square dungeon is perhaps left as a warehouse or living quarters, but new towers growing along the perimeter of the walls become round. The walls become higher. Stone galleries with battlements appear, behind which crossbowmen can hide. This is no longer just the Lord's house. It is a complex, expensive machine for killing and survival. The cost of such construction was prohibitive. The erection of one large castle could cost as much as the income of a rich barony for 10 or 15 years. Lords went into debt, mortgaged lands to monasteries, robbed neighbors, all for the sake of finishing the construction. An unfinished castle is money thrown to the wind. It will not protect. By the middle of the 10th century, our hill has been transformed. The wooden palisade has disappeared. Now the summit is crowned by a crown of gray stone. Powerful walls, round corner towers, a high dungeon proudly towering over the district. This stone monster seems empty and dead without people, but it is not empty. Inside, life boils, about which we know surprisingly little because we are used to looking at knights and not at those who clean their armor and bake their bread. Stone walls need to be guarded, heated, and serviced. It is time to look inside and meet the real inhabitants of the castle, and most likely you will be surprised to learn who commanded there in reality. When we imagine a castle, imagination paints us a courtyard packed with hundreds of knights in shining armor who train with swords all day, preparing for battle. Reality was much quieter, more boring, and frankly speaking, more economical. To maintain a full army on a permanent basis is financial suicide. Even the richest count could not afford to feed 100 professional killers when there is no war. Therefore, in peacetime, our huge stone giant was surprisingly sparsely populated. If we peeked in here on an ordinary Tuesday of the 10th century, we would discover that the garrison consists of only a dozen people. Yes, you heard right. A mighty fortress could be guarded by just 2 or 3 knights, a sergeant, and 10 crossbowmen or archers. This was quite enough to chase poachers, collect tolls at the bridge, and close the gates for the night. The main person in the castle 90% of the time was not the lord at all. The lord is a busy figure. He may have 5, 10, or even 20 estates scattered throughout the country. He travels between them with his court, eating up supplies in one place and moving to another.
The castle is not so much a home as a hotel for the owner, in which he stays a couple of months a year. While the master is away, the castellan reigns. The castellan is a manager, commandant, and director all in one. This is a person whom the Lord trusts more than his own brothers. It is on the castellan's belt that a bunch of heavy iron keys hangs, from the gates, from the armory, and from the treasury. His power in the absence of the master is absolute. He judges peasants, oversees the repair of roofs, purchases grain, and pays the guards' salaries. The castellan's work is pure logistics and accounting. Preserved account books that time show us not the romance of feats, but endless lists. Bought 3 barrels of herring, repaired 5 carts, replaced a cracked link in the drawbridge chain. The second most important figure you will definitely meet at the entrance is the porter. This is not just a doorman. Usually, this is a veteran, an experienced warrior who lives in a small cubicle right inside the gate tower. His task is face control. He knows all the locals by face. No one will enter or leave the castle without his knowledge. The porter was often responsible for security at night, checking if the guard was sleeping on the walls. Now about the soldiers. Why crossbowmen and not knights? Because for the defense of walls, a crossbow is much more effective than a sword and spear. A crossbowman can be trained in a couple of weeks, but a knight needs to be raised from childhood. Moreover, a crossbowman eats less and requires a smaller salary. In case of a sudden attack, specifically these shooters had to delay the enemy for those few hours or days while the castellan sends messengers to the lord's vassals with a cry for help. But the military is only the tip of the iceberg. A castle is an autonomous life support machine. The majority of the population was made up of those who held not weapons, but hammers, ladles, and brooms. The blacksmith was indispensable. Something always broke in the castle. Horseshoes, door hinges, barrel hoops, arrowheads. The forge never cooled down. Nearby worked the carpenter. Wood still remained an important part of the structures: ceilings, scaffolding, furniture, carts. A special place was occupied by the chaplain. The priest in the castle was often the only literate person, except perhaps the castellan. Therefore, he also worked as a secretary and a scribe and a teacher for the garrison's children. The castle chapel was the spiritual center of this small community. And of course, the kitchen. This is a factory of processing products. Here worked a whole army of cooks, kitchen boys, butchers, and bakers. A lot of food was required. Even in peacetime, the castle fed 50 to 60 people daily. And if the lord arrived with his retinue, the population of the fortress could grow to 300 people in 1 hour. The kitchen on such days turned into hell. Heat from huge hearths, shouts, the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine. There is a myth that a castle is a purely male space. This is untrue. Women lived and worked here constantly. Chroniclers simply rarely mentioned them unless they were noble ladies. Laundresses played a key role. In the Middle Ages, washing was titanic labor. Clothes were boiled in lye, an infusion of ash, then rinsed in icy river water. But their work was a matter not only of cleanliness, but of survival. Lice and fleas were carriers of diseases. A good laundress who regularly boiled the garrison's linen saved more lives than the thickest shield. The castellan's wife often managed all internal affairs: stocks of fabric, candles, tableware. If the castellan was the director of security, then his wife was the director of the household. All these people, soldiers, artisans, servants, their wives and children, lived in a very enclosed space. Inside the Bailey walls, it was cramped. Wooden and stone annexes clung to each other. Personal space practically did not exist. People slept huddled together in the great hall or in workshops, ate at common tables, worked side by side. Such crowding bred specific domestic problems. Imagine winter, windows closed with shutters, inside an open fire burns. It smells of unwashed bodies, cooking food, dampness from the stone, and animals from the stable. Life in a castle was far from a fairy tale. It was a test of endurance, where the most terrible enemy often became not the storming squad, but the cold, darkness, and banal unsanitary conditions. It is exactly about this domestic nightmare about which chivalric romances remain silent that we will talk next. Romantic films have accustomed us to seeing life in a castle as a series of feasts in brightly lit halls where ladies in décolleté listen to minstrels and logs crackle cozily in huge fireplaces. If a person of the 21st century ended up in a real residential castle in the winter of the 10th century, the first thing they would feel is cold, piercing to the bone. A stone castle is, in essence, a huge artificial cave. Walls 3 meters thick possess colossal thermal inertia. In summer, this is salvation. It is cool inside, even if there is heat outside. But in winter, the walls accumulate cold. They draw heat out of every living thing. The stone freezes through and works like a giant refrigerator that cannot be turned off. Heating was the main technological problem of the Middle Ages. In early dungeons, fire was built right in the center of the hall in an open hearth, and the smoke went out through a hole in the ceiling or through high windows. This meant that the upper part of the room was always filled with acrid smoke, making eyes water and throats tickle. Smoked in the castle were not only the hams hanging under the ceiling, but also the people. Later, with the appearance of wall fireplaces and chimneys, it became easier to breathe, but not warmer. The physics of an open fireplace is such that 90% of the heat flies up the chimney along with the smoke. The fireplace warms only what is directly in front of it. From the front, your face is burned by the flame, and your back, at this same moment, freezes from the draft.
It was drafts that were the real scourge of castles. The wind roamed the spiral staircases, whistled in the loopholes, and penetrated through cracks in the shutters. To somehow retain heat, the castle interior was turned into a multi-layered cocoon. Here lies the solution to the purpose of tapestries. We are used to seeing them in museums behind glass as a work of art, but for the castle owner, it was primarily insulation. Heavy wool carpets hung along the walls created an air gap between the icy stone and the living space. They worked like drywall or modern insulation panels. The richer the lord, the more walls are covered with fabric. Floors were also insulated. A thick layer of straw or reeds, sometimes mixed with fragrant herbs like lavender or mint, was laid on the stone slabs. This covering was springy underfoot and insulated a little from the cold below. But this metal had a reverse side. The straw in the great hall was changed not so often, sometimes once a season. During this time, scraps, spilled beer, dog droppings, spit, and dirt from boots accumulated in it. By spring, the carpet began to live its own biological life, exuding a smell that modern people would find unbearable. The second problem is light, or rather its absence. Glass in castle windows appeared far from immediately and cost fabulous money. Usually, windows were covered with oiled parchment, mica, or simply wooden shutters. This meant eternal twilight. Even on a sunny day, twilight reigned inside the donjon. And at night, absolute thick darkness set in, which we, residents of electrified cities, have already forgotten. Lighting cost a lot. Beeswax candles, which burn cleanly and smell of honey, were a luxury item. They were used only in church or on the table of the highest nobility. Most inhabitants of the castle used tallow candles. They were made from rendered animal fat, beef or mutton. Such candles smoked, melted quickly, and most importantly, while burning, emitted a heavy smell of frying lard and burnt meat. The poor and servants made do with an even cheaper option, rushlights or bowls with fat into which a reed wick was lowered. The light from them was dim and unsteady, so life in the castle froze with sunset. People went to sleep early not because they loved the regime, but because burning candles for nothing was wastefulness. The third important aspect of daily life, about which tour guides are often shy to speak, is the toilet. In a medieval castle, it was called by the elegant word garderobe. It was a small room protruding from the castle wall, a kind of stone bay window. Inside was a stone or wooden bench with a hole. All waste fell straight down, into the moat or into a special cesspit at the base of the wall. No water seals, no siphons, only a direct shaft down. In winter, an icy wind blew from there, so there were no fools to sit in the garderobe for long.
In some castles, these shafts became a vulnerability. History knows examples when daring saboteurs penetrated the fortress by climbing up the pipe with sewage. But why was this place called a garderobe, that is, a place for storing clothes? This is not a translation error. Medieval people were observant. They noticed that the sharp smell of ammonia rising from the shaft scares away fleas and moths. Therefore, expensive woolen cloaks and fur coats were indeed hung in toilet rooms. It was the most reliable dry cleaning of that time, guaranteeing that insects would not eat your ceremonial clothes. By the way, about insects and hygiene, there is a persistent myth that medieval people did not wash at all and walked in a crust of dirt for years. This is untrue. Dirt was not considered a virtue. Cleanliness of the body was associated with cleanliness of the soul. The problem was not the desire to wash, but logistics. Imagine you want to take a hot bath. There is no running water. To fill a wooden tub, servants need to bring 200 liters of water in buckets from the well in the courtyard, lift them up the spiral staircase to the third floor, heat this water in cauldrons over a fire, and a large cauldron might not exist, and pour it into the tub lined with fabric so the Lord doesn't get a splinter in a soft place. This process took several hours and required the labor of 3 or 4 people. Therefore, a full hot bath was an event, a luxury available to the Lord once every couple of weeks or before holidays. The rest contented with wiping down with a damp cloth and washing hands and face from a pitcher. Hands were washed necessarily and often, before eating and after, since they ate mostly with hands. Soap existed, a soft paste of ash and fat, often with the addition of herbs like lavender or mint. Teeth were cleaned with a rag with chalk, or twigs of medicinal plants were chewed. People tried to be clean as much as the harsh environment allowed.
The inhabitants of the castle slept specifically too. A bed was the most expensive piece of furniture, often costing more than all the other belongings. The lord's bed was wide, under a baldachin or canopy. Thick curtains were drawn at night not for privacy, but all for the same warmth, to create a small enclosed space that could be warmed by breath. They usually slept naked or in nightcaps so the head wouldn't freeze. Servants and soldiers slept where they worked, on benches in the great hall, on straw in the stable, or right on the floor by the hearth, huddled in a pile like puppies to warm each other. Personal space was a concept from the distant future. Life in a castle was a constant struggle with discomfort. But people did not complain. They knew. Thick, cold walls smelling of smoke and dampness, this is the only thing that separates them from death. And soon, the inhabitants of our castle will have to verify this in practice. Dust from the hooves of enemy cavalry rises on the horizon. Questions of warmth and a soft bed recede into the background. That for which all this was built begins: defense. If one looks at the plan of any castle from above, the gaze involuntarily clings to one detail that seems like a mistake. Among the monolithic, thick walls, there is always a gap: the gates. It seems this is a vulnerability. Why build an impregnable stronghold if there is an entrance door in it that can be kicked in? But the medieval architect was not only a builder, but also a psychologist. He knew that the enemy would always go along the path of least resistance. No one wants to hammer a 3-meter wall with a pickaxe when they see gates. That is exactly why the gates of the castle were designed not as an entrance, but as the most deadly trap in the entire fortress. It was an invitation to death. Let us walk this path through the eyes of an attacking soldier to understand the cynical and effective logic of castle defense. The first thing the enemy encounters, before even reaching the main walls, is the barbican, a small advanced fortification brought forward. Often it was placed to force the attacking column to turn. This is not accidental. Most people are right-handed. A warrior holds a shield in the left hand, swords in the right. Architects specifically designed the approach to the gates so that the attacking group walked along the wall with their right side, unprotected by the shield. From above the walls, archers could punish the open sides and backs of the attackers with impunity.
This is called the rule of the shield, and it worked flawlessly for centuries. Having overcome the barbican, you run into the moat. In movies, moats are always filled with water in which crocodiles swim. In reality, there were no crocodiles in Europe, and water was far from everywhere. Dry moats were encountered more often. Their bottom was studded with sharp stakes hidden in high grass or piled with thorny bushes. The task of the moat is not to drown the enemy, but not to let him approach the wall with a battering ram or siege tower. To break the gates, one must first fill the moat under a hail of arrows. The only path across the moat is the drawbridge. This is a genius mechanism on counterweights. Two heavy stone weights or chains with a winch allowed just 2 guards to lift a huge oak platform in a few seconds. In the raised state, the bridge covered the gates, becoming an additional shield. But let's assume the bridge is lowered or the enemy managed to throw over their planks. The attackers burst into the gate tower, and here the main mousetrap snaps shut. Inside the gate tower, it is dark and cramped. It's a narrow stone tunnel. From the front and rear, portcullises suddenly fall. A portcullis is a heavy grate of oak, shod with iron with sharp teeth at the bottom. Why a grate and not a solid door? Because through the grate, defenders can stab the enemy with long spears and shoot from crossbows while remaining in safety. The attacking detachment finds itself locked in a stone sack. There is no way back, no way forward. And overhead, murder holes open. In the ceiling of the gate passage, holes were specifically left. Through them, defenders located on the floor above could methodically destroy the enemies trapped below. Here, it is necessary to dispel one of Hollywood's most popular myths. Boiling oil almost never was poured on the heads of enemies. Oil in the medieval ages was a very expensive product. It was eaten. Lamps were filled with it. To spend it by the barrel on war was insane wastefulness. Molten lead is also expensive. Reality was more prosaic and cheaper. They poured boiling water. Water is free. They poured red-hot sand. Sand is terrible. It gets into the joints of armor, burns through the under-armor clothing, sticks to the skin, and it is impossible to shake it out. They threw heavy stones, used quicklime, which corroded eyes and lungs. If the enemy decided not to go through the gates, but to storm the walls, another surprise awaited him. Look at the upper edge of the wall. The crenellations, resembling the silhouette of a crown, are called merlons. They are needed not for beauty. This is cover. A shooter takes a shot into the embrasure, or crenel, and then hides behind the stone merlon to reload the weapon.
But the most interesting invention is machicolations. In early castles, to shoot at someone standing right under the wall and hammering the foundation with a pickaxe, a defender needed to lean out up to the waist, risking getting an arrow in the forehead. Later, architects began to move the combat gallery slightly forward on stone brackets. In the floor of this overhanging gallery, hatches were made. Now it was possible to throw stones and pour boiling water vertically down, remaining under the full protection of the wall. These are machicolations. They liquidated the dead zone at the foot of the wall. The walls themselves are cut with narrow slits, loopholes. From the outside, it is a narrow strip into which it is almost impossible to get an arrow, but inside, the loophole widens, forming a niche where the shooter can comfortably position himself and change the angle of fire. A vertical slit for a bow. A slit with a transverse crossbar, resembling a cross, for a crossbow, which needs space for horizontal limbs. The entire architecture of the castle is the geometry of murder. Towers protrude from the wall not just like that. This allows for crossfire. If the enemy climbs the wall between 2 towers, he receives arrows not only in the face from the wall, but also in the sides from neighboring towers. This is called flanking. An ideally designed castle does not have a single blind spot where an arrow would not reach. Even spiral staircases inside towers worked for defense. Almost all of them are twisted clockwise if climbing from the bottom up. This gave a huge advantage to the defenders. He who stands higher and retreats, the defender,
holds the sword in the right hand, and nothing hinders him from striking a blow. He who attacks from below, the attacker, bumps his right hand with the sword into the central pillar of the staircase. He cannot swing. Exceptions were only in the castles of left-handed lords, but this is the rarest exoticism. It would seem this system is impossible to hack. A castle of the 10th century is the pinnacle of fortification thought. A small garrison of 50 people could hold back an army of 1,000 soldiers for months. A force ratio of 1 to 10 was considered normal for successful defense. However, even the most perfect wall has a limit of durability. Architects built their masterpieces counting on infantry, ladders, and light throwing machines. But war is a competition of sword and shield. While masons erected walls ever higher and thicker, engineers on the other side of the barricades also did not sit with folded hands. They prepared an answer against which geometry is powerless. Siege machines capable of hurling stones the weight of a horse are pulled up to the castle. The battle of engineers begins. Silence for the defenders of the castle was scarier than the noise of battle. If the enemy does not go for an assault, does not climb the walls with ladders, but calmly sets up camp at a safe distance, this meant one thing: a long game is beginning, a game in which time works against those inside. The most eerie sound in such days was the sound of axes from the nearby forest. This meant that enemy engineers had begun to build siege machines. By the 10th century, the art of destroying walls reached its peak. The main hero of this theater of destruction became the trebuchet. This word is often confused with a catapult, but the difference between them is fundamental. An ancient catapult worked due to twisted ropes or sinews, torsion energy. A trebuchet works due to the force of gravity. Imagine giant scales or a well sweep. On the short arm of the lever hangs a huge box filled with stones or lead, a counterweight weighing 10 or 15 tons. On the long arm is a sling with a projectile. When the mechanism is released, the counterweight falls down. The long lever soars into the sky. The sling makes a whipping swing, and a stone weighing 100 or 150 kilograms flies in a high arc. The trebuchet was the superweapon of the Middle Ages. It hit far, accurately, and crushingly. A team of good engineers could sight the machine so as to hit the same point of the wall time after time, blow after blow, day after day. Stone masonry calculated for direct strikes by a battering ram crumbled under plunging fire. The stone shook the structure of the wall, causing cracks, and at some moment a section of fortification simply slid into the moat in a pile of rubble. But trebuchets were used not only for destruction, it was a weapon of psychological terror. Over the walls were thrown not only stones, but also incendiary mixtures, severed heads of prisoners to demoralize the garrison, and even animal corpses. A carcass of a dead horse swollen in the sun, fallen in the middle of the castle courtyard, is a biological bomb. Stench, flies, and the risk of an epidemic forced defenders to think about surrender faster than a breached wall. However, even the most perfect wall has a limit of durability. Architects built their masterpieces counting on infantry, ladders, and light throwing machines. But war is a competition of sword and shield. While masons erected walls ever higher and thicker, engineers on the other side of the barricades also did not sit with folded hands. They prepared an answer against which geometry is powerless. Siege machines capable of hurling stones the weight of a horse are pulled up to the castle. The battle of engineers begins. Silence for the defenders of the castle was scarier than the noise of battle. If the enemy does not go for an assault, does not climb the walls with ladders, but calmly sets up camp at a safe distance, this meant one thing: a long game is beginning, a game in which time works against those inside. The most eerie sound in such days was the sound of axes from the nearby forest. This meant that enemy engineers had begun to build siege machines. By the 10th century, the art of destroying walls reached its peak. The main hero of this theater of destruction became the trebuchet. This word is often confused with a catapult, but the difference between them is fundamental. An ancient catapult worked due to twisted ropes or sinews, torsion energy. A trebuchet works due to the force of gravity. Imagine giant scales or a well sweep. On the short arm of the lever hangs a huge box filled with stones or lead, a counterweight weighing 10 or 15 tons. On the long arm is a sling with a projectile. When the mechanism is released, the counterweight falls down. The long lever soars into the sky. The sling makes a whipping swing, and a stone weighing 100 or 150 kilograms flies in a high arc. The trebuchet was the superweapon of the Middle Ages. It hit far, accurately, and crushingly. A team of good engineers could sight the machine so as to hit the same point of the wall time after time, blow after blow, day after day. Stone masonry calculated for direct strikes by a battering ram crumbled under plunging fire. The stone shook the structure of the wall, causing cracks, and at some moment a section of fortification simply slid into the moat in a pile of rubble. But trebuchets were used not only for destruction, it was a weapon of psychological terror. Over the walls were thrown not only stones, but also incendiary mixtures, severed heads of prisoners to demoralize the garrison, and even animal corpses. A carcass of a dead horse swollen in the sun, fallen in the middle of the castle courtyard, is a biological bomb. Stench, flies, and the risk of an epidemic forced defenders to think about surrender faster than a breached wall. However, even the most perfect wall has a limit of durability. Architects built their masterpieces counting on infantry, ladders, and light throwing machines. But war is a competition of sword and shield. While masons erected walls ever higher and thicker, engineers on the other side of the barricades also did not sit with folded hands. They prepared an answer against which geometry is powerless. Siege machines capable of hurling stones the weight of a horse are pulled up to the castle. The battle of engineers begins. Silence for the defenders of the castle was scarier than the noise of battle. If the enemy does not go for an assault, does not climb the walls with ladders, but calmly sets up camp at a safe distance, this meant one thing: a long game is beginning, a game in which time works against those inside. The most eerie sound in such days was the sound of axes from the nearby forest. This meant that enemy engineers had begun to build siege machines. By the 10th century, the art of destroying walls reached its peak. The main hero of this theater of destruction became the trebuchet. This word is often confused with a catapult, but the difference between them is fundamental. An ancient catapult worked due to twisted ropes or sinews, torsion energy. A trebuchet works due to the force of gravity. Imagine giant scales or a well sweep. On the short arm of the lever hangs a huge box filled with stones or lead, a counterweight weighing 10 or 15 tons. On the long arm is a sling with a projectile. When the mechanism is released, the counterweight falls down. The long lever soars into the sky. The sling makes a whipping swing, and a stone weighing 100 or 150 kilograms flies in a high arc. The trebuchet was the superweapon of the Middle Ages. It hit far, accurately, and crushingly. A team of good engineers could sight the machine so as to hit the same point of the wall time after time, blow after blow, day after day. Stone masonry calculated for direct strikes by a battering ram crumbled under plunging fire. The stone shook the structure of the wall.
But even if the walls stood firm and sappers could not dig through the rock, the besiegers had a main ally left: hunger. A medieval castle is many people in a small area. Stocks of grain, salted meat, and wine tend to run out. Water ends especially quickly if the summer is dry and cisterns are empty. A siege turned into a competition of resources. Who will run out of food sooner? The army outside, which ravaged the entire district and which also needs to feed thousands of soldiers, or the garrison inside? In this mathematics of survival, there was no place for pity. When supplies came to an end, the commandant of the castle made a cruel decision: to get rid of extra mouths.
Women, children, old people, and servants who could not hold a weapon were simply driven out the gates. The calculation was that the enemy would either let them pass or take them prisoner. But often the besiegers refused to let the refugees pass so as not to make life easier for the garrison. These unfortunate people found themselves trapped between the closed gates of their native castle and the line of enemy spears. They died of hunger and cold before the eyes of their fathers and husbands standing on the walls. This was monstrous pressure on the psyche of the defenders. People inside began to eat what in peacetime they did not consider food. First, they slaughtered horses. For a knight to eat his war horse is a tragedy comparable to the loss of a friend, but hunger is stronger. Then dogs, cats, and rats went into action. Chronicles describe cases when the besieged boiled and chewed leather from shields and belts, trying to deceive the stomach. It was hunger and not a heroic assault that put a period in the history of most great sieges. The castle surrendered when the defenders could no longer lift a sword from weakness. But in the middle of the 14th century, a force intervened in this familiar scheme of war that did not distinguish who was besieging and who was besieged. It passed through closed gates, flew over high walls without trebuchets, and killed without missing. On a ship arriving from distant Kaffa to the port of Genoa, not only merchants came ashore, but also black rats with small fleas in their fur. Europe stood on the threshold of a catastrophe compared to which any war turned out to be child's play. Silent death was approaching our castle. 1348. A messenger knocks at the castle gate. The horse is driven to exhaustion. On the rider's face is horror. He brings news that is scarier than any declaration of war. From the south, from the port cities, a pestilence is advancing. People call it the Great Pestilence. Descendants will call it the Black Death. The Lord orders the bridge raised, the portcullis lowered, the gates locked with all bolts, archers placed on the walls with orders to shoot anyone who approaches the castle closer than the flight of an arrow. No guests, no trade, no wanderers. The castle goes into a regime of total isolation. The inhabitants believe that the thick stone walls that saved them from fire and sword will save them from the disease too. It seems to them that they are safe, like a submarine. This was a fatal mistake. Walls could stop an army, but they could not stop biology. The enemy was already inside. It arrived not through the main gates, but through the back door, along with the last cart of grain that they managed to bring into the barns before closing. Along with the sacks, black rats slipped into the castle. For a medieval person, rats were such a familiar part of everyday life that they were simply not noticed. They rustled in the straw on the floor, ran along the beams of the kitchen, but in the fur of these specific rats sat fleas in the stomachs of which the bacterium Yersinia pestis multiplied. The castle, designed as an ideal shelter, instantly turned into an ideal incubator for the epidemic. Remember what we talked about earlier: cramped conditions, crowding, common bedrooms, lack of sewage, an enclosed space where people breathe the same air and sleep side by side. First, the rats began to die. People found their little corpses in storerooms and corridors. The fleas, deprived of hosts, needed new warm blood, and they found it in humans. The first to fall ill, most likely, was someone from the servants in the kitchen or in the stable. Symptoms appeared suddenly. In the morning, a person felt a slight chill. By lunch, they shook in a fever, and by evening, in the groin, armpits, or on the neck, monstrous, painful swellings the size of an apple, buboes. The course of the disease was rapid. From the first symptoms to death often passed less than 3 days. The horror of the situation in the castle lay in the impossibility of escape. In the city, one can try to leave for another district, go to a village. In a closed castle, there is nowhere to run. The infection spread along the chain of hierarchy from bottom to top. A maid cleaning the lady's chambers brought fleas on her dress. The cook preparing food for the lord fell dead right at the hearth.
Very soon, the well-tuned machine of castle life broke down. There was no one to carry water, no one to bake bread. Horses in the stables stood unfed and howled from hunger because the grooms had died. The most terrible moment came when the priest, the chaplain, fell ill. Medieval people feared death, but even more, they feared dying without confession and absolution of sins, which threatened eternal torments in hell. When the chaplain died, the castle plunged into spiritual panic. The dying confessed to each other, but the fear of eternity drove them mad. Death equalized everyone. The plague didn't care about coats of arms and titles. The Lord died in his luxurious bed with a baldachin exactly the same as the last farmhand on the straw. Chronicles of those years are dry, but behind the stingy lines hides an apocalypse. In some castles, the entire garrison and the entire family of the owner died out. The gates remained locked, the bridge raised, and inside reigned dead silence. Neighbors understood what happened only when smoke stopped rising from the chimneys above the walls and ravens began to circle over the courtyard. According to modern estimates, the epidemic of the mid-14th century claimed the lives of 30 to 60% of the population of Europe. For our castle, this meant that out of 50 inhabitants, 20 remained alive. Those who survived walked out of the gates into another world. The psychology of people had changed. They saw that prayers did not help, that wealth did not save, that the old order had collapsed. But the main change was economic. Suddenly, it turned out that there was a catastrophic shortage of working hands. Before the plague, there were many peasants and little land. The Lord could dictate any conditions. If a peasant refused to work for pennies, he was kicked out, and 10 willing people came to his place. Now, the fields stood abandoned. The harvest rotted on the vine. The Lord who survived the plague discovered that he was fabulously rich in land, but a beggar because there was no one to plow this land. Surviving peasants and artisans realized their value. They began to demand. They did not ask. They specifically demanded higher pay, better food, lower taxes. The golden age of the working man, as historians sometimes call the period after the Black Death. Lords had to concede. The castle ceased to be only a center of force. It became a center of bargaining. To hire a garrison, one now had to pay with ringing coins, and pay a lot. The old feudal system, based on loyalty and duty, cracked. Money came to its place. War also changed. Knightly honor, vows, and oaths faded into the background. People entered the scene for whom war was simply a way to earn, mercenaries. And our castle, barely recovered from the smell of death, prepared to become a base for the most cynical and cruel dogs of war that Europe had ever seen. By the end of the 14th century, our castle changes its character. If earlier it was the home of a feudal lord bound by an oath of loyalty to the king and an oath of protection to the peasants, now it turns into something completely different. It becomes a business center, the office of a corporation trading in violence. We are entering the era of the 100 Years' War. But forget about school textbooks where this conflict is depicted as a series of heroic battles like Crécy or Agincourt. Big battles happened rarely, once in 10 or 20 years. The war of that time was endless, exhausting raids, robberies, and blackmail, and the castle became the main tool in this dirty game. The garrison now consists not of loyal vassals, but of professionals, mercenaries. These are people without a homeland and flag. Gascons, Bretons, English, Germans, they serve him who pays. Their captain concluded a contract, or, as they said then, an indenture with a king or duke. Under this contract, he is obliged to hold the castle and provide a certain number of lances. But kings at that time were chronically insolvent, salaries were delayed for months, and then the castle switched to self-sufficiency. The captain of the castle looked at the surrounding villages not as protected subjects, but as a resource base. A system was introduced, which in France was called pâtisse. In essence, this is racketeering in pure form. Peasants paid the garrison money, grain, or livestock, not for protection from enemies, but so that the garrison itself would not burn their houses. The castle turned into a base for raids known as chevauchés. A group of horsemen burst out of the gates at dawn, swept through the territory of the enemy, or simply a neighbor, burning mills, driving away livestock, and seizing everything that was not nailed down. In the evening, they returned back behind thick walls where no one could reach them. The basements of the castle, where previously supplies were stored in case of siege, now were packed with looted goods: rolls of textile, silver tableware, barrels of wine, and even church utensils. But the most profitable commodity was people. War became a commercial enterprise, and prisoners the hardest currency. If in battle a knight saw an enemy in expensive armor, he tried not to kill him, but to stun or knock him off his horse. To kill an enemy means to deprive oneself of profit. To take prisoner means to hit the jackpot. The prison in our castle at this time is not a damp stone sack for torture as in horror movies. It is rather a waiting room for valuable assets. A noble prisoner was kept in comfort. He was fed from the master's table, given wine, allowed to walk in the inner courtyard under supervision. Why? Because he is a walking check for 1,000 gold francs. If he dies of a cold or hunger, the captain will lose money. Prisoners wrote letters to relatives begging to sell land, pawn jewelry, and collect the ransom. Complex negotiations were conducted in the castle. Promissory notes were drawn up. Notaries worked. Often intermediaries were merchants or bankers who transferred money across the borders of warring states. It was a cynical industry. There even existed prisoner exchanges where rights to the ransom of some count could be resold to another owner, just as debts are sold to collectors.
But what happened when the war, or its active phase, ended, and the king declared a truce? For the castle, this was the most terrible time. Thousands of armed men remained without work. The king stopped paying even those pitiful crumbs that he promised. To return home, to plow the land after you were used to wearing silk and drinking the best wine? Of course not. Mercenaries huddled into so-called free companies, and our castle often became their victim. Sometimes they seized it by trickery, disguised themselves as merchants, hid weapons in carts with hay, or simply bribed the guard. Having seized the castle, a gang of brigands turned it into a robber's nest. They terrorized the district for tens of kilometers around. Neither the king nor the local authorities could do anything about it. To storm such a fortress was too expensive and difficult. Often, the only way to get rid of the invaders was to pay them. Cities and monasteries chipped in, collected a gigantic sum, and literally bought out their own castle from the bandits, just so they would leave to rob in another place. In this period, the architecture of the castle also changes slightly, adjusting to mistrust. Inside the garrison reigns suspicion. The lord or captain no longer trusts his people. The owner's chambers are separated from the other premises even more reliably. Separate staircases appear, secret passages allowing the captain to leave the castle unnoticed, or conversely, to lock himself in the donjon for mutinous mercenaries. The castle became a symbol of oppression. If in the 10th century peasants ran to the walls seeing salvation in them, then at the end of the 14th century they looked at these towers with hatred. The castle was a parasite sucking juices from the earth. It is exactly at this time that a thought begins to mature in the heads of kings. These fortresses are becoming too independent, too dangerous. The private war waged by castle owners is ruining the state. But how to take his stone stronghold from a baron if the walls are impregnable and a siege lasts for years? The answer came from the laboratory of alchemists: black powder, a mixture of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal. At first, it was treated as a curiosity, scaring horses with a loud bang. The first cannons, bombards, were funny. They exploded more often, killing their own artillerymen, than they caused harm to walls. But progress is inexorable. By the beginning of the 15th century, casters learned to make barrels that did not burst upon firing, and engineers guessed to replace stone cannonballs, which often split upon impact, with iron ones. A new era was coming. an era that will sign the death warrant for our stone giant. His high, proud walls, created to be unreachable for ladders, will turn out to be the ideal target for that which flies on a flat trajectory with monstrous speed. Imagine yourself in the place of an architect whose family has built this castle over 5 generations. Your great-grandfather erected the square donjon. Grandfather surrounded it with a wall. Father added round towers. All your professional wisdom passed from mouth to mouth boiled down to one axiom: the higher, the safer. A high wall is a guarantee that the enemy will not climb up. And here, in the middle of the 15th century, you stand on this wall and understand that everything you believed in has turned into a death sentence. Height no longer saves, height kills. The gunpowder revolution didn't happen instantly. The first cannons of the 14th century were rather a psychological weapon. They rumbled, released clouds of stinking smoke, but fired stone balls or huge arrows that bounced off walls just like trebuchet projectiles. Knights laughed at these firepots, calling them toys of the devil, unworthy of noble combat. But by the mid-15th century, the laughter died down. Metallurgists learned to cast long and durable barrels. Chemists selected the ideal proportion of the gunpowder mixture, corned powder, which burned instantly, creating monstrous pressure. And most importantly, stone balls were replaced by cast iron or iron ones. The difference was colossal. A stone ball, upon impact with a stone wall, often split itself, absorbing part of the impact energy. An iron ball did not split. All the kinetic energy accumulated in flight went into the point of impact. Imagine the physics of this process. A cannon hits not with a lob like a catapult, but with direct fire. The ball flies parallel to the ground with huge speed and crashes into the base of the wall. It knocks out masonry, turning stone into dust. A second shot, a third, a 10th, all in one point. The base of the wall turns into dust, and here that very height of which builders were so proud comes into play. The heavy upper part of the wall, having lost support, simply collapses down under its own weight. A high tower becomes unstable and falls like a sawn tree. What was built for decades, artillery of the 15th century could turn into a pile of rubble in 3 days of intensive bombardment. Castle owners were in panic. They tried to adapt. First, they began to punch loopholes for handheld firearms in their walls. You can see them in old castles. They look like an inverted keyhole, a round hole at the bottom for the barrel of a musket or arquebus, and a narrow slit on top for aiming. Then they tried to strengthen the walls themselves. Towers began to be shortened. High pointed roofs and upper floors were cut off from them. Insides were filled with earth and rubble to create a massive cushion capable of absorbing the blow of a cannonball. But this was agony. The geometry of the castle was hopelessly outdated. Vertical walls were the ideal target. To survive under cannon fire, one needed to become not high, but low and thick. Thus was born the new science of fortification. Romantic towers were replaced by bastions. These were squat, angular earthen mounds faced with stone or brick. Earth dampens the blow of a ball better than any granite. The ball simply gets stuck in the soil without causing harm to the structure. New fortresses, star forts, spread out on the ground like a flounder. Their walls were built at tricky angles so that balls would ricochet. But our castle, standing on a high hill, could not turn into such a fortress. It simply did not have space for wide earthen ramparts. Its fate was foretold. This technical change entailed a tectonic shift in politics. Previously, any baron who had a castle could say no to the king. To punish a rebel, the king needed to gather an army, come, surround the castle, and sit under it for half a year. It was expensive and long. Often, kings waved their hand and made concessions. Now, everything changed. Siege artillery is an insanely expensive pleasure. To cast one large cannon cost as much as building a small church. Only kings could maintain a staff of gunners, purchase tons of gunpowder, and most importantly, transport these multi-ton barrels on bad roads. Artillery became the last argument of kings in the literal sense. King Charles VII in France or King Henry VIII in England could approach the castle of any rebellious duke and smash his walls to smithereens in a week. The era of feudal freedom ended. The castle ceased to be a guarantor of independence. It became simply housing. For our castle, this was the moment of truth. Its military function died. It could no longer protect its master from a modern army. Before the owner stood a choice: either abandon the old, cold, and useless fortification and leave for the city, or try to turn the veteran of war into a peaceful pensioner. In the 15th century, fear recedes into the background. Vanity comes to the fore. The owner looks at his gloomy walls and thinks, since they can no longer protect me from cannons, let them at least tell everyone about my wealth. The Great Reconstruction begins. The rough warrior takes off his armor and puts on a velvet doublet. The castle, which for centuries snarled at the world with narrow loopholes, prepares to open its eyes, windows wide. The era of the Renaissance is coming, and our stone giant gathers to try on the mask of a palace. The 15th century brings a strange sound to our hill. It is again the sound of hammers and chisels on stone, but now it sounds not alarming but festive. Masons destroy walls not because a cannonball pierced them, but because the master ordered so. An action unthinkable for a military man takes place. In thick, 3-meter defensive walls, which for centuries were guarded like the apple of an eye, giant holes are cut. The defensive belt, which was supposed to be a solid monolith, turns into a sieve. The castle owner no longer fears an assault. Or rather, he has resigned himself that his castle is useless against royal artillery and the guard will protect from robbers. Now he has another goal. He wants light. The Middle Ages are often called the Dark Ages in a figurative sense, but for a castle dweller it was dark literally. Now, however, under the influence of fashion arriving from sunny Italy, architecture turns its face to the sun. Into the cut openings, not oiled parchment is inserted, but glass. This is a revolution. Transparent, clear glass still costs a lot, but now prestige is measured not by the height of the tower, but by the area of glazing. Huge bay windows appear, flooding halls with light. The castle, formerly a stone cave, becomes a lantern. In some English estates of that time, they said, more glass than wall. The second revolution happens in the heating system. Remember those smoking heaths and drafts? They are replaced by brick chimneys of complex design. Now a fireplace can be put in every room and not just in the main hall. This changes the very structure of life.
After the sappers leave, silence sets in. The castle lies in ruins. It is impossible to live in it. Roofs have collapsed. Fireplaces hang in the air on the remains of floors. The wind walks through the halls. The owner, if he survived at all and saved money, builds himself a new mansion somewhere in the neighborhood, modern, brick, without any defensive pretensions. And the old castle enters the saddest phase of its existence. It becomes a quarry. Local peasants, residents of the town at the foot of the hill, look at the ruins not as a historical monument, but as a warehouse of free building materials. Why hew new stone if thousands of ready, perfectly processed blocks lie on the hill? First of all, the most valuable thing disappears. Lead from the roofs and iron. Staples, hinges, nails are torn out of the walls. As soon as the roof disappears, water begins its destructive work. Rain penetrates into the core of the walls, freezes in winter, expands and tears the masonry from the inside. Then they begin to drag away the stone. Many farms, barns, roads, and even churches in the district are built from the flesh of our castle. If you walk through a neighboring village and look closely at the foundations of old houses, you can see stones there with traces of carving or even pieces of our Lord's coat of arms. The castle slowly dissolves into the landscape. It overgrows. Nature takes its own. Trees grow on the top of the crumbled donjon. Their roots penetrate between the stones, continuing to destroy what gunpowder did not finish. The moat turns into a swamp overgrown with reeds. By the beginning of the 18th century, on the site of the formidable stronghold, only a green hill remains with fangs of gray walls sticking up here and there. People forget the names of the towers. They forget where the entrance was.
Shepherds drive sheep where once knights gave vassal oaths. It seems that history is finished. The castle died, turning into a landscape. But time has a sense of irony. Another 100 years will pass, and these useless ruins, overgrown with ivy, will suddenly become insanely fashionable. People will stop seeing in them a source of stone and will begin to see in them a source of inspiration. Ghosts of the past are preparing for their last exit on stage, this time as romantic heroes. For almost 100 years, our castle was just a pile of stones that hindered plowing the land. Farmers looked at it with irritation and builders with greed. But at the end of the 18th century, an amazing metamorphosis occurs. Those very crumbled walls, which were considered trash, suddenly acquire a new non-material value. Europe is changing. The Industrial Revolution begins. Cities fill with the smoke of factories, the noise of machines, and the dirt of overpopulated quarters. People, tired of suit and rationalism, begin to seek refuge in the past. They want a fairy tale, wild nature, and noble antiquity. A new cultural movement is born, Romanticism, and our semi-destroyed castle becomes its ideal scenery. Now they climb the hill not with a pickaxe to steal stone, but with an easel to draw this stone. The ruin becomes fashionable. Aesthetes of that time discuss the category of the sublime. For them, a collapsed tower overgrown with ivy is more beautiful than a whole one, because a whole tower is just a building, but a ruin is a symbol of the victory of eternity over human pride. Ivy, by the way, becomes the main enemy of engineers and the main friend of artists. Romantics adore ivy. They believe that greenery entwining dead stone is poetic. None of them thinks that the roots of the plant penetrate into the seams of the masonry, turning lime mortar into sand and accelerating the destruction of walls tenfold. If you see on an old engraving picturesque thickets on a wall, no, specifically at this moment, the building was dying fastest of all. Together with artists come the first tourists. These are rich gentlemen and ladies making the grand tour or travels around their native country in search of the picturesque. Visiting a castle in the 19th century differed greatly from a modern excursion. No fences, no signs, caution, rockfall. Ladies in long dresses scrambled up shaky stairs, risking breaking their necks. Gentlemen chipped off pieces of stucco for souvenirs. To arrange a picnic right in the former throne room, spreading a tablecloth on the grass among the debris was considered the height of sophistication. It is specifically at this time that the castle begins to become overgrown with legends that it did not know in the Middle Ages. In the real Middle Ages, people feared devils, demons, and the restless souls of sinners, but their fears were religious. In the 19th century, fear becomes entertainment. Literature in the genre of the Gothic novel requires ghosts, and if the castle doesn't have its own staff white lady or black monk, they simply invent them. Guides of that time, often these were local residents wishing to earn, composed on-the-go, blood-curdling stories about unfaithful wives walled up alive, about bloodstains that don't wash off for centuries, and about the clanking of chains in dungeons. Most ancient legends that you will hear today on excursions were born exactly then, in the era of Queen Victoria, under the pen of writers or in the imagination of bored tourists. It reached absurdity. Rich people who did not have real ruins in their estates began to envy them. They hired architects to build a fake, sham ruin in their garden. A brand new, just-built wall was specifically broken, smoked with fire, and planted with moss so that it looked ancient. Against the background of these fakes, our real war-damaged castle looked like an aristocrat.
But by the mid-19th century, the mood changes again. Romantic contemplation of withering is replaced by an active desire to save history. The era of Great Restoration begins. Architects of a new type come to our hill. The most striking example of such an approach is the Frenchman Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. But such people were in every country. They sincerely loved the Middle Ages, but loved it with a strange love. They wanted to make it better than it was in reality. Restoration begins. Debris is cleared, breaches are laid with new stone. But restorers of the 19th century do not simply conserve what remains, they fantasize. Here must be a high tower with a pointed roof, decides the architect, looking at the foundation, and builds it. Even if historically the roof was flat and the tower low, it seems to him that this is more correct, more medieval. The castle receives new battlements that it never had. Chimeras and gargoyles are added to it because it is fashionable. Interiors are painted with bright colors, creating a fairy tale image of chivalry which did not exist in reality. Many famous castles that we admire today, for example, Pierrefonds in France or Carcassonne, and even many Scottish castles, are half 19th century new builds. This is not a document of history, but a dream of a Victorian person about chivalry embodied in stone. For our castle, this is a double-edged sword. On one hand, restoration saved it from complete disappearance. If the walls had not been strengthened then, today there would be simply an earthen hill on this spot. On the other hand, under a layer of new brick and plaster, real scars of time disappeared. Traces of cannonballs were smeared over, inconvenient layouts corrected. The castle turned into a museum. Lords no longer live in it. Garrisons do not stand in it. Its only function now is to show itself. Ticket offices appear, first guidebooks are printed. History finally becomes a commodity. But this is not the end yet. Ahead is the 20th century, which will bring new, unexpected threats and force us to rethink the very concept of authenticity. After all, when the dust from world wars settles, archaeologists will ask an uncomfortable question: and what of what we see is the truth? We return to where we started, to the top of the hill, above the bend of the river. The sun is leaning towards sunset, and long shadows from crenellated walls lie on the valley, exactly as they lay 1,000 years ago. If we speed up time, scrolling our history like a film strip, we will see an amazing spectacle. We will see how a rough wooden palisade smelling of fresh resin grows out of the earth, how it turns black from fire and time to give way to gray, cold stone. We will see how towers stretch upward, challenging the sky, and then, in fear, press to the ground, hiding from artillery. We will see how severe loopholes turn into wide windows of a palace, and then into empty sockets of ruins. And finally, we will see how ruins become overgrown with construction scaffolds of restorers and queues of tourists. A castle is not just a building. It is a stone chronicle of human fear and human pride. Every stone here was laid by someone's hands, hands of a person who most likely starved, froze, and feared, but continued to hew granite because he had no choice. Behind every wall stands an economic calculation. Behind every tower, someone's ambition. Think about the founder lord. He built this fortress to immortalize his lineage. He believed that his blood would rule here forever. He was mistaken. His lineage probably was interrupted 500 years ago. His name was erased from the tombstone in the castle chapel, but his creation outlived him. The paradox is that stone turned out to be more reliable than blood. The history of the castle teaches us humility. It shows that any, even the most powerful protection, is temporary. There is no such wall that cannot be destroyed. There are no such gates that later or earlier will not open by force, cunning, or gold. In the era of swords, people built walls against swords. In the era of cannons, they built bastions against balls. Today, we do not build stone castles, but the psychology of the besieged fortress has not disappeared anywhere. We build other walls. We surround ourselves with complex alarm systems, digital passwords, gated residential complexes, and high fences of private property. We still fear the outside world. We still want to create a safe space where we are complete masters. Listening to the history of this castle, we were actually listening to the history of ourselves. Technologies change, from the crossbow to the drone, from the cesspit to the sewer, but the nature of man remains unchanged. We still seek safety, comfort, and status. Now, when you leave this hill, turn around for the last time. Look at the silhouette of the tower against the background of the sky.
This castle saw epidemics that mowed down half the population. It saw wars that seemed endless. It saw a change of religions, kings, and political systems. It saw the birth and collapse of empires, and it still stands. Perhaps in 1,000 years, when our skyscrapers of glass and concrete crumble into dust and our digital archives disappear, these stones will still stand on the hill, and someone else will climb here, run a hand over the rough masonry, and ask, who were these people? What did they dream about? And why did they think they were building for centuries? Today, our journey begins not at the drawbridge, but at the turnstile. We buy a ticket, put on audio guide headphones, and enter under ancient vaults. Around us is cleanliness, neat signs, and soft lighting. But the paradox of the 21st century lies in the fact that exactly now, when we guard these walls so carefully, we see them perhaps in the most distorted form in all of history. The modern tourist, looking at stern gray stones, thinks how gloomy and brutal it was in the Middle Ages. This is one of the main visual errors. We are used to the aesthetics of bare stone. It seems to us that naked masonry is honest, it is real. But if a builder of the 14th century saw his castle today, he would burn with shame. For him, bare stone meant only one thing: the owner has no money for finishing. In reality, medieval castles were bright. From the outside, they were often whitewashed with lime. A snow-white tower shining in the sun was visible for tens of kilometers, declaring power. Inner courtyards could be plastered and painted with geometric patterns in ochre and red lead. Inside the halls, walls were covered with frescoes, were covered with colored fabric. What we see now is a skeleton. We ourselves in the 20th century stripped the castles of their skin, removed the remains of plaster so that they corresponded to our idea of the gloomy Middle Ages. We created a myth and embodied it in stone. But modern science gives us tools to look deeper than the visual image. While tourists take photos on towers, below in excavations, archaeologists are working, and they look not for gold or swords at all. Gold was taken out by victors centuries ago. Swords rust on battlefields. The most valuable find for an archaeologist is a trash pit, or even better, the contents of an ancient toilet. It is exactly here, in layers of compressed organic, that the real life of the garrison is hidden. Analyzing remains of seeds, pollen, and animal bones, scientists restore the diet with accuracy to the gram. We learn that the garrison ate a lot of fish on fasting days, that they imported figs from southern countries, that they suffered from specific types of intestinal parasites. This is not a heroic, but an absolutely reliable history of everyday life. Another powerful instrument of truth is dendrochronology. Studying annual rings on preserved wooden beams of ceilings, specialists can name not just the year, but the season when the tree was felled. This allows dating stages of construction with an accuracy that old historians, guessing by chronicles, never dreamed of. Often it turns out that a tower which was considered Roman was actually built in the 12th century, and an ancient fireplace is an insertion of the 19th. Today's castle faces a new problem which did not exist before. This is the problem of preservation ethics. Imagine a 12th century wall is crumbling. Rain and wind have done their job. What to do? There are two paths. The first is the Disneyland path. We can finish building the wall with new stones, make it smooth and beautiful like in a movie. Tourists like this. It is understandable, it is photogenic, but it's a lie. We create a model destroying authenticity.